Thank you, Dave. I'm humbled standing in front of so many oil and gas experts and who have so much enthusiasm and excitement for the subject. And forgive me for talking about something completely different now. You'll probably all get very bored. Security after In Amenas. Thank you, David, for organizing such an event with such panache. My name's Henry Jones-Davies. I'm Joint Managing Director of LPD Risk Management Limited. My fellow Managing Director, Gabriel Carter, is here. I've been a security consultant for a number of years and have considerable experience working closely with the oil and gas sector. I spent 4 years in Algeria in the early 1990s, first as a security consultant with Bechtel on the construction of the Transmed pipeline, and then 3 years with BP's security department in Algiers itself. As you know, this was during the period known as the Décennie Noire, or the Black Decade, a period of unprecedented violence and chaos. Just briefly, I'm also mindful of David's point that people don't like too much sales pitch, but I have to run you through this quickly. This is our company. I won't bore you with reading it all out, but you can see what we do. We're a new company, and we're a small company, and we're really what might be called a boutique risk management consultancy. This is the range of what we cover. If anyone wants I can contact me or Gabriel afterwards, and we can send you a PDF of this, and I won't go too much into that now. We work together with Petromal. Greg Coleman has approached us, and we decided that our two disciplines work very well together. The Petromal, of course, who sponsored this event. And here you see how we decided that we could work very closely together, where risk and where security and oil operations come together. To go to the subject in hand, here, and this is slightly facetious, but there you see what I imagine these guys wanted to look like, and down below is what they actually do look like. In Amenas, in southeastern Algeria, the actual place where this happened was Teguin Turin, the BP Statoil facility there. And you can see here the guy in charge of the operation, Mokhtar Belmokhtar, who stayed safely out of the way, managed it from a distance. This guy was the commander who was killed, and a Nigerian, and this guy a Libyan, an Algerian who was also killed. This was the sequence of events. You probably know this. I won't bore you with it too much, but the sequence of events. The initial assault before dawn. A convoy of buses was attacked. These were guys, one BP operations liaison coordinator, taking a group of people on their 6-week or month turnaround, going to the airport, which is about 50 kilometers from Teguin Turin site, and they were attacked, and two Britons, BP OLC and one Algerian, a gendarme, were killed during the firefight. They then went on to take hostages within the complex, and the Algerian, as you know, the Algerians then moved in very heavy-handedly and in their own way, and they have every right to do so. 69 people were killed, including at least 39 hostages, 3 Britons, etc., 3 US citizens, 1 French national. 29 terrorists, this is very significant, 29 terrorists were killed, 3 arrested. They were an international bunch from Canada, Mauritania, Egypt, Tunisia, Mali, Niger, and Algeria. 685 Algerian workers and 100 foreigners escaped or were freed. If we look at again, this is totally familiar to you, so I won't bore you with it. I haven't actually distinguished between the oil and gas fields, but this is just the general picture that we've seen in earlier talks today. And this is an area in Algeria where the Tuaregs live, in the Sahel and Sahara. And here we see where the activity of the various Islamist groups. And these, as you can see, are critical areas where security impacts. And let's just take a look at what happened. Sorry, I've got a bit out of control here. The areas which we're dealing with here, of course, are absolutely vast. Alistair Horn, in his book on the Algerian War of Independence, asks you to put a compass point on Algiers up there and stick the other compass point down here, somewhere in the Hogar Mountains or around Tamanrasset. Swing it round the other way, and it reaches Newcastle. It's that big. And when you look, the whole length of the Sahel right across here is roughly the same distance as from London to the Caspian Sea. Thousands of kilometers, a vast area in which people can move around. The group which carried out this attack was called the Al-Mulathamin Brigade, or the Masked Ones, who also called themselves the Al-Mukayun Bildima, those who sign in blood. And this is what might loosely be termed a branded franchise of AQIM, the grandly named Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Belmokhtar, the guy we saw in the middle there, is a terrorist, a racketeer, and a smuggler who first came to prominence as a commander of the GIA, the underground Islamist army which fought the Algerian government for a decade. I remember him when I was there. We called him Old Glass Eye, and he's actually only 40 years old, so he must have been in his 20s when back in those days. And when this conflict ended, the organization morphed into a group called the GSPC, the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat, which in turn and in time found went into partnership with its co-idealists of Al-Qaeda. And either through internal squabble or for reasons of power play, Belmokhtar recently formed his own group, the AMB, and plotted the In Amenas attack. Despite the group's claim that the assault was triggered by the French intervention in Mali, which took place just a few days before, this was obviously a carefully planned action which must have been several months in the making. The logistical requirements alone make this perfectly clear. And during the 1990s, the Algerian government declared that it had erected a ring of steel around the oil and gas operations and deployed substantial military resources to safeguarding what was and remains practically its only source of export income. As events have proved, these stringent measures have been largely successful. There had been no terrorist attacks on Saharan installations, nor on the pipelines and the LNG plants, apart from one attack on the Transmed gas line to Italy, which was put out of action for 5 days in 1997. There are a number of unanswered questions about this attack. Was it through incompetence, complacency, or a lack of decent intelligence, whether human intelligence or signals intelligence, or a combination of all these? There are credible reports of inside help. In fact, one of the terrorists apparently had a cousin whose trucking company was on contract at the facility. And as in any semi-tribal society, such close relationships are common. We've talked about the Tuareg tribes there. Now, anyone who's been to the desert for any considerable time knows that there's not much that happens there, however vast, that isn't noticed by someone, and that information is passed on. And Algerian intelligence will have its contacts and informants in the remotest places, and yet a column of technical vehicles was able to cross vast areas of desert with all the problems of supply, refueling, and movement, and managed not only to penetrate a carefully zoned area, but to pass straight through the so-called ring of steel. Again, the terrorists were reported as using satellite communications. Was no chatter intercepted at all by either the Algerian SIGINT specialists or even, at a stretch, our own GCHQ? The faith of international companies in the ability of the Algerian security forces to protect their workers and investments has, quite obviously, been severely shaken. Quite obviously and reasonably, they will be undertaking thorough reassessments of their North African operations and are likely to be far more circumspect when considering expanding operations in the region. Now that the In Amenas facility has shut down, Algeria has lost around 10% of its gas production, and it is not yet clear how long it will be before the plant starts up again. and BP is naturally cautious, and it's too soon to judge when Tegen Turin might be operational again, the site being essentially now a scene of crime. And as far as Libya is concerned, the situation is far more tenuous and fluid. While the Algerian army is generally a well-organized and disciplined force with decades of experience in counter-terrorist warfare, in Libya, as we've heard from Matt here, any form of oil protection force is at an embryonic stage. One could argue that a similar operation there at present would serve only to embarrass the government, simply because there are very few foreigners working there. Ransom value and consequent international publicity would be low. Last summer, in my personal observation, there were only, I went round about 7 or 8 oil fields doing security audits, and I think I counted not more than 10 Europeans working in the camps. One must ask, will there come a point when the IOCs decide that the risk outweigh the rewards in North Africa? Is the threat to safe operations in these countries a growing one? And if so, at what point will it no longer be feasible to continue? This is the area here where most of the danger is at the moment. And of course, with the French pressing up here and the Algerians now taking a harder line, this area will no longer be safe for terrorists to operate in. This is In Amenas after the event. That's a recent photograph of Algerian security forces, and they put up all these barriers and so on, a little bit late in the day. Of course, the colored areas that we just looked at in that last slide are generally areas of poverty, political discontent, deprivation, lack of economic activity, lack of education and ignorance, a powerful seedbed for extreme religious political beliefs. Advantages taken of porous borders, the revolution in Libya, of course, and the resultant flood of arms and fighters into this area. These are areas where government security forces find it hard to operate, and there are traditional smuggling routes, whether for drugs, guns, and people, and they crisscross that whole region. Whatever cover these deserts and mountains have provided, armed groups here now are being pressed and cornered. Yet they managed to survive, but they inevitably will be squeezed out. And David Cameron, you remember, I think last week said, supported by none other than Tony Blair, speaks of a decades-long struggle against a dangerous and growing enemy. Is he right? Peter Bergen, CNN's security analyst, has this to say: the attack in January on a gas facility in Algeria by an al-Qaeda-linked group has sparked an outpouring of dire warnings from leading Western politicians. Cameron described a large and existential threat emanating from North Africa. Tony Blair, his predecessor, said, Cameron is right to warn that this is a battle for our values and way of life, which will take years, even decades. Before we get all our knickers in a tremendous twist, he asks, how exactly does an attack on an undefended gas facility in the remotest depths of the Algerian desert become an existential threat to our way of life? To date, no known attacks or aborted attacks in the West have been directly linked to this organization, AQIM. The fact is that however one disparages the war on terror, Al-Qaeda has suffered a series of devastating blows over recent years. A number of its leaders have been killed and networks infiltrated and broken up. In Libya, the militant group which carried out the attacks on the US consulate in Benghazi in September, in which 4 Americans were killed, Ansar al-Sharia, or supporters of Sharia, which is the local AQ franchisee. And in Yemen, we find similar groups aligned with al-Qaeda, calling themselves Ansar al-Sharia. But in neither country has the branding endeared them to the local population. In Libya, shortly after the attack on the US consulate, an angry crowd of some 30,000 locals stormed Ansar al-Sharia's Benghazi headquarters and drove them out of town. And in Yemen, jihadists have now been forced out of the towns in the south they once held. Now, this isn't to say that whatever we call them, or they call themselves, jihadist Salafist groups still remain a formidable threat to international security. And we mustn't forget that. They constantly struggle to adapt themselves to new, less congenial operational environments. During this period, there could be continued small-scale attacks, mostly against accessible, soft targets. As military and government targets increase their protection levels, softer targets, such as economic and commercial targets, become more attractive, a fact that has major implications for the security industry, for the insurance industry. These groups will no doubt continue to aim for more incidents with far-reaching psychological repercussions on society, such as suicide bombings, assassinations, and killings. But we should maintain a balanced and sensible view as to the threat, seen as capability and intent, and risk as probability and impact. So what is needed? The maintenance of an active global coalition against terrorism in general, and terrorist groups in particular, to ensure that their support base is weakened. Historically and statistically, terrorist groups have an average lifespan of 13.5 years. It is essential to reinforce counter-terrorist structures and train personnel to meet current and future threats. Terrorists carefully research their targets to find vulnerabilities, and the patient terrorist waits for its targets to soften and authorities to become complacent, which is what appears to have happened in Algeria. So it is important for security specialists to select and prioritize targets from the terrorist point of view, hence the importance of modeling. So really we should be looking for a beefed up security by the Algerian government, an urgent review of strategy, better training, intelligence, better cooperation internationally, and the careful and diplomatic sharing of intelligence and information from a number of sources. I would presume they will now go for more active contact with local tribes, the Tuaregs in Algeria, the Tebu in Libya, with proper concern for their needs and demands. For Libya, the ground-up building of OPF, of an oil protection force, is absolutely essential. But I found in Libya, when you mention security, and the Libyans are quite right about this, they don't want foreign security companies coming in, as in Iraq, with guns, telling them what to do. And they all know the lesson, what happened with Blackwater in Iraq, and they're absolutely determined that that won't happen in Libya. So containment, vigilance, cooperation, effective production of installations in larger secure areas, desert passes, zoning, etc., and greatly improved standard operational procedures, better liaison between security forces and operations liaison consultants and managers. To preempt the possibility of green on blue attacks, we might learn from the experience of In Amenas to consider detailed vetting of local national staff, which, it must be admitted, will be difficult and problematic in largely tribal Muslim societies, such as Algeria, and more particularly in Libya, but it must nevertheless be considered. There should be better cooperation, I would suggest, between IOCs themselves, their security departments and governments, enhanced security SOPs, better intelligence gathering through HUMINT, SIGINT, and aerial surveillance strategies. We would also recommend, within reason, better training and SOPs for expatriate workers and the provision of easily accessible, safe areas within camps. The list goes on. But let me show you some examples of where we stand today with as far as oilfield security is concerned. Now this is photograph some oil fields in Libya. This one is in the south, and this one is in the southwest, and this one is in the east. And you can see there's a Brazilian Urutu APC. They've got technical vehicles, such as we saw in Matt's lecture. A variety of these, bewildering variety of ordnance, and I think there's I don't know if it's a T-72 anyway. These are camps situated perhaps 300 or 400 yards from these military camps situated 300 or 400 yards from the actual oil camps themselves. Here is an example of some vehicle control points. Again, you can see there's very little that could be done in the event of a full-on attack, such as in Amenas. They tend to have these barriers, which are oil drums filled with concrete. This is a zone here, a military zone here, and a checkpoint. And when I went through that checkpoint, actually they behaved very well and wouldn't let me out because I didn't have the right paperwork. But you can see it really needs a lot of beefing up. This is also in Libya. A fairly decent sand berm there, sort of stabilized with oil. The usual 2-meter high chain link fence with barbed wire. There's a detail of it there. And this is in the this is up in the eastern part. This is in the southwest. I won't say where they are, but this was a control point here, which is completely smashed up. There was nobody there. The wonderful gate, but it was wide open. Anyone could walk in. This system looks very good. It's got an anti-ram barrier there. It's got sensors, but none of them were working. So all that needs to be done. This is, again, perimeter fences. Look at the state of these. And some of these here, that's open to the outside world. And they have, reasonable security at the front gate, but this is the back gate. So, just before I finish, let's look at the economic impact. Just how worried should Europe be about the security of its oil and gas supplies? Even during the terrible civil war in the 1990s, IOCs, in particular BP, managed to keep operations going. And BP signed its first major Algerian deal, the 2.7 billion In Salah gas project, against a backdrop of violent insurrection. The In Amenas contract was signed and owned by Amoco, and after the merger of the two companies, it passed to BP, and then Statoil came in 2003. So what are the long-term effects on Europe's gas supply from North Africa? I quote from a paper by a gas expert, Dr. David Drury, with whom I work very closely in, many of you will know him, whom I work very closely in Algeria. He says, Algeria is the EU's third largest external gas supplier after Russia and Norway, and supplied 11.1% of EU gas demand in 2011. Algerian supplies are even more crucial for southern European countries. He says, at least so far, the loss of the In Amenas supply does not seem to be causing too many problems in the markets. A combination of recession and low carbon prices has created European gas demand, which fell some 9.9% in 2011 and a few percentage points in 2012. With buyers already looking to reduce their contractual take, a limited loss of supply from Algeria will probably come as a welcome relief in that sense. So it's a very interesting view, this. He concludes, the plain fact is that North Africa is figuring much less in Europe's future gas supply plans than it would have in the early 2000s. The gloss has also gone off Libya as a potential source of extra gas for Europe. So, the threat is real, but it isn't as extreme as David Cameron would have us believe. But we have to keep an eye on everything here. The jihadist Salafist threat will continue. It is my view that when the lessons of In Amenas have been learned and the security departments of the IOCs are reassured that the enhanced security is properly prioritized and in place, then oil and gas operations in North Africa can continue as successfully in the future as they have in the past. In Amenas came as a wake-up call. The action itself was not unexpected, only the location and the ferocity of the attack. The mission was a complete failure. The gas facility was not destroyed, and it will be made operational again. It will have come as a huge embarrassment to the Algerian government, but this is why they dealt with it in their own way, and it was a combination of brutal determination and pride, which one has to have experienced the situation in the 1990s to fully understand. If the lessons are learned, and they are lessons for both the Algerian and Libyan economies, then the involvement of IOCs in both countries has a future. If not, and I say this only partly in jest, only the bravest and best insured will continue. So there is basically the conclusions that I think we should make. It remains a threat in Libya and Syria. I'm like Matt. I'm cautiously optimistic about Libya. I think Libya will get it together. It's the people's will to get it together. And once they get a grip of the militias and rehabilitate them within society, things will start to settle down. We've gone through all this here, a wake-up call, thorough review. Basically, oil and gas operations in Libya in Algeria and Libya will continue, and security companies are there to help you and advise you on letting them continue. Thank you very much.
Two things. Maybe our panel could start moving into their highly luxurious seats here, and while they're doing that, we could take any questions for, please, one here.
Henry Lang, Golder Associates. I must admit, in North Africa, we've retreated to an office in Malta at the moment. But what were they trying to achieve? What is the actual, I suppose back to basics. If you've got a group causing a problem, try and understand what they're seeking to achieve. And for the life of me, I don't see what they were seeking to achieve there.
I think what they were seeking to achieve was a very good question. I'm sorry I didn't cover. I didn't want to go into too much detail, but what they were seeking to achieve, of course, was to grab as many people as they could, wire up explosives around their necks, take them off to a different location, and then ransom them. Belmokhtar has done this over, cash. Belmokhtar has done this over a number of years, quite successfully, it has to be said. And this was a really, they were really going for the big one on this one, but of course it didn't happen. But that's basically, yes, cash.
I'm afraid I have to disagree with you on that one, but we can discuss the reasons later.
Yeah.
If you have a country where 85% of its GDP comes from the oil and gas industry, and where with a certain amount of resource nationalism in the last few years, you have an over-reliance on expat technical expertise.
Yeah. What
they've effectively done now is they've ensured that Algeria's single economic strength is attacked. I can't say much, but the hostages thing was very quickly disproven. There are three problems that are going to be facing operations in the future. The first one is the restriction the Algerian military will place. We were already working under a very restrictive regime there. There will be an even more restrictive regime with additional items of security that will make mixing with CPFs and refineries very difficult. The second one is confidence. I think you hit a very valid point on the vetting. And one thing I would say is physical security is no use unless you've got confidence in those who are controlling the gates. The final one is the profits and the financing side of life. We saw from Oz's presentation at the beginning of the day, 80%, 90% of profit taken. When you have additional costs where people are looking for additional day rates, the trick is going to be how much will the Algerians renegotiate on their profit share. The security paradigm that we've had within North Africa, we've had within the region, has been fundamentally challenged. And in some ways, the trick is actually not to specialise, but to go the other way.
Are you trying to get a question out?
Well, no, it's just I was there. I was there.
No, but
the point I'm slightly. There are a lot of things being said, right, and there are a lot of things that I would prefer we were clear on. And the thing that I would like to highlight here is that there are better ways of operating in the future, and it is still a country. I'll be going back there tomorrow if I could. There are better ways of doing things, but it's still very early days to make hard and fast judgments.
Okay. Sure.
Please respond.
No, absolutely. I mean, I agree with all that. Yeah. It's just a question of when companies have the confidence to go back in. It hangs in the balance at the moment.
Yeah, I think that, in my mind, there's a distinction actually between companies having the confidence to go back in and expats having.
I mean expats. Sorry. Yeah.
Because I think if I was working for BP at the moment and my CEO said you go, I'll say no, you go instead.
But I find in Libya, I found guys who'd been there. They'd been there through the revolution, and nothing had happened to them. And they were quite happy with the situation. But perhaps after this, they won't be quite so.
Okay, thanks. One more question, please.
Algeria's got the military. What about Mali and Niger?
Well, yeah, exactly. The French are in there to try and beef that up. It's a very difficult one, and it's going to be, they're going to have to be there for a longer time than I think they're planning. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank you, Henry. Thanks very much.